Hello, everyone, and welcome to Jonathan's students, and also welcome Bruce and everyone else online. As Marian said, I'm with the Canadian Studies Centre, Jackson School of International Studies, and really proud and happy to have Jonathan with us. He is from the University of Manitoba, the first university in Western Canada, founded in 1877. So we're really pleased to have him here from UM. And Jonathan is here as this year's University of Washington Fulbright Chair in Arctic Studies. So just fabulous. We have this chair on an annual basis. And with Jonathan, we're really exploring the areas of environmental sustainability, and environmental humanities and so forth with 6 of his colleagues as part of this lecture series. And just before I turn it over to Jonathan, just as by way of a land acknowledgement, today and yesterday were beautiful days on the West Coast where the University of Washington sits. And just an acknowledgement and a moment to just reflect on our stunning fortune to be in such a beautiful and safe place, an inspiring place. And thanks to the welcoming of the Coast Salish peoples who have been here for millennia, and also the natural environment and our non-human kin. And also to say that the Jackson School of International Studies acknowledges sovereign Indigenous nations, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, American Indians, and other Indigenous groups globally. So with that, Jonathan, thank you again for a fabulous series course, and I'll pass it to you. Thank you for being here from the Oregon coast and making it back for this.
Thanks so much, Nadine, as always. You're absolutely right. It's been a glorious couple of days here in Seattle. It's really wonderful to be here. I can also say that where Bruce is joining us from Winnipeg, it's no longer the heartland of subarctic Canada. It's now officially spring, I think. Bruce, you can confirm or deny that, but also nice in Winnipeg. Let's just put it that way. It is melt season, not spring, as we refer to it in Winnipeg. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Bruce Erickson, a close colleague and friend of mine from the University of Manitoba in the Department of Environment and Geography, where Bruce is an associate professor and also acts currently as the graduate chair. Bruce Erickson's work is in the cultural politics of outdoor rec and tourism. This work draws from political ecology, cultural geography, cultural theory, and I think dabbles in environmental history to ask how recreation and leisure spaces might be a lens into our understandings of nature, modern environmentalism, and the connections between the state and settler, the ongoing phenomena of settler colonialism. Bruce is hugely prolific, hugely accomplished. He's known all over as the author of Canoe Nation, Nature, Race, and the Making of a Canadian Icon from UBC Press in 2013. He's known also for a couple of other edited volumes, The Politics of the Canoe, Activism and Resistance, which came out a couple of years ago, edited with Sarah Wiley-Krotz. You'll notice a theme there, which is interesting because I don't think Bruce has ever actually been in a canoe. He can confirm or deny that as well. He's also the editor of the 2009 volume with Kate Sandilands, Queer Ecologies, Sex, Nature, Politics, Desire. He's been published widely in a whole slew of journals, Environment and Planning D, Society and Space, Leisure Studies, Canadian Geographies, ACME, the International Journal, Critical Geographies, among many others. Many of you will be interested in a new chapter that we were just chatting about that's come out in a new volume from University of Manchester Press called Ice Humanities, Living, Working, and Thinking in a Melting World, edited by Klaus Dodds and Sverker Sorlin, two giants of the environmental humanities and social sciences. It's a wonderful piece. Today, Dr. Erickson will be talking to us about some of the material in that recent piece, but also departing to talk about the SS Manhattan in his talk, Future Perfect Ice, Colonialism, Futurity, we had temporality, but we've changed it up to Futurity,
Oh.
and the Anthropocene North. Just a note before I pass it over to Dr. Erickson, we're very delighted to take questions during and after the talk. Please feel free to put them in the chat function or in the Q&A function of the Zoom. We'll also figure out a number of other ways for you to ask questions after the talk. So for now, let's pass it over to you, Dr. Bruce.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. That was a very detailed introduction, and now you have my CV. That was kind of it. So thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Nadine, for having us here, and of course also thank you, Marion, for coordinating and providing the support for this. And of course also thanks to the Canadian Studies Centre for hosting this year's series, and also the ones that have happened in the past. It's got a long and distinguished history there that I'm honored to be a small part of. So as Jono said, I'm a faculty member at the University of Manitoba in the Department of Environment and Geography, and I live here in Winnipeg, which means that I live and work on Treaty 1 land in Canada, which is the home of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dene, and the Dakota peoples, and also the homeland of the Métis Nation. Those histories are a clear part of the kind of work that I do, and so my hope in this practice as a faculty member, as an academic, is to be able to help that conversation become more prolific and more important to how we live our lives on Treaty 1. So as John said, this paper has a bit of a history to it. Let's see if I can actually go forward. There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today kind of comes out of it's like a little bit of a weird Frankenstein paper, where I'm mashing up two things that have been done in the past. And so the first one is this paper called Ice Futures, the Extension of Jurisdiction in the Anthropocene North, which I wrote with Liam Kennedy Slaney and James Wilt, which is poorly written on there as wild. This is characteristic of my attention to detail. So Liam and James and I came up with this paper trying to bring together our areas of interests in the North around polar bears for Liam and ice science for James, and tries to think through the kind of ways that those areas are projecting a certain type of knowledge in the North about ice, and how that knowledge sort of projects us forward into the future a little bit. And that sort of lens of thinking about the future also comes from a paper that I wrote in Environment and Planning D called Anthropocene Futures, Linking Colonialism and Environmentalism in an Age of Crisis. And in that, I'm trying to sort of think through and try to chart out the ways that our stories about the environment as it is being more and more an item of concern and an item which we are planning our future around, shapes larger governance patterns, and specifically around colonialism. And so in the paper, we start with the phrase from Patrick Wolf that colonialism, settler colonialism, is a structure, not an event. And I suggest somewhere down in the middle of the paper that the Anthropocene, this sort of geological epoch, should also be considered a structure, not an event, as something that has longer implications, not just for the geological record, but also the kind of larger governance and cultural patterns that we have here. And so the attempt today is to try to bring these together a little bit and to sort of think through the lens of jurisdiction, ice, and this grammatical tense that I'll introduce you to later, or maybe not introduce you, but remind you of later, called the future perfect. And so obviously this points out that what I'm doing today is really built on the work that I've been doing with others, so with Liam and James, but also the Anthropocene Futures paper came out in an edited special issue with Andrew Baldwin, and so his kind of imprint is on my thinking there as well. So to start, I think we can go back to the Hudson's Bay Company, because I think this is a good starting point for this paper, thinking about the kind of unbridled imperial conceit of the Hudson's Bay Company's original charter from 1670. So this is a charter which granted the company granted the company trading rights to about 40% of what is now known as Canada. And it wasn't just trading rights, but also governing duties over that area. So the backstory here is that there is interest in trading in Canada by several adventurers and explorers, and they tried to sell that to various different European countries, and eventually found the cousin of the king, whose name was Prince Rupert, and created this company, and the king then was like, sure, I can give my cousin some good favor here. And so this gift was given to the company despite relatively little knowledge of the territory and absolutely no knowledge of those who occupied this territory. And it famously covered the lands which drained into the Hudson's Bay, which of course at that point in time was totally unknown to the company, right? They had no idea where the boundaries of these lands were and what was there. And the crown that authorized that charter also had no clue of this. And so it was given to them on the basis of promise of future profits, but also the promise of future settlements. The company was to try to explore and potentially colonize the land in the name of the king, and they were to do this through the profits of the company's trade. Now, these attempts to actually settle or even really to explore the lands covered by this charter really only came to fruition in fits and spurts under the company, and mostly in the last 100 years of its charter, right? It wasn't ever a kind of real goal of the company for the first half of its use of this charter. And the claim to jurisdiction that was made in the charter and is still held ceremoniously in the Hudson's Bay headquarters in Toronto was challenged over and over again on many fronts. So there were rival trading companies that tried to challenge it. There were internal political enemies. There was the French military that challenged it. And most certainly there were Inuit, Innu, Dene, and Cree hunters, residents, and traders that continually sort of challenged the HBC's jurisdiction on this land. Now, the HBC's hold on this charter was to last 200 years, and then the governing jurisdiction for these lands was eventually bought out by the British state, which of course had originally granted it for free, and transferred that over to Canada in 1870. So I start with this because this charter is an example of a colonial dream of a northern future of abundance, where beneath an imagined desolate and uninviting environment lies an opportunity for profit for those who are able to seize it. And any quick glance through the history of the North American North can uncover a number of these futures of promised abundance over the years. In Canada, our national history is punctuated by these waves of interest in the abundant North, from the search for the Northwest Passage, to search for gold or oil or gas exploration, through to the more recent interest in the quote unquote opening of the North through climate change. The North in these waves was a place to anchor national dreams of development and identity. Some of these sort of stories of abundance actually sound fairly familiar to those of us today. So for example, an 1888 Senate report on the resource potential of the Mackenzie River Valley reported hundreds of thousands of acres of prairie lands suitable for growing barley, potatoes, and pasturing animals, and also contained a large petroleum area so extensive as to justify the belief that eventually it will supply the larger part of the continent and be shipped from Churchill, Manitoba to England. Now in Manitoba, over the past year, we've heard this proposal over and over again as the conflict in the Ukraine has prompted several politicians to imagine an expedited route across the northern prairies that connects Churchill to northern Alberta and beyond, to be able to ship natural gas and tar sands oil to Europe to help, sort of solve the crisis of energy. Now, sometimes the visions of the future North are clearly tainted by the perspective of that view. So for example, traveling in the Northwest Territories in 1911, Ernest Thompson Seton, a naturalist and the co-founder of the Boy Scouts, assumed that the subarctic regions could be a human paradise that would be an empire, quote, peopled with white men. And it would be built around the great arable region of wheat harvests north of 60, which obviously never panned out. The Arctic explorer Wilhelm Stephenson promoted Arctic development by arguing that the global center of civilization has consistently been moving northward and would eventually settle in the far north. For Stephenson, he wrote, there is no northern boundary beyond which productive enterprise cannot go till north meets north on the opposite shores of the Arctic Ocean. Now, these are all very clearly Southern dreams of an abundant North. And I'm sure we could go on and on with examples of them, both from history and also into the present. But we obviously have a different story of the North that we're hearing more about today as we see renewed interest in the future of the Arctic. But often these stories and these visions are anchored not by abundance, but by loss. And ice here is a kind of prominent example. Ice has become the metonym that speaks for the drastic changes happening in the Arctic. And the general sentiment is that the future of ice is foreclosed. Thus, glancing through the titles of books published about the North recently, we're not surprised to find titles like Farewell to Ice or The Arctic Melt. Ice becomes shorthand for a particular set of concerns about the North and the oncoming challenges of the Anthropocene. What I hope to show throughout today, though, is that this shorthand is also a particular way of thinking about the North that tends to ignore the specific relationships that are enmeshed in the North and depoliticizes our concern for what happens with, through, on, and without ice. Now, the important discursive switch from the future imagined by the Hudson's Bay Charter and that which starts to take place in the latter decades of the 20th century is from a future of abundance, whether it's furs, profits, or settlements, to a future of less ice, fewer polar bears, maybe even less control. And there's a good example that can kind of encapsulate this transition and illustrate both sides. And that example is the transit of the Northwest Passage by the SS Manhattan in 1969 and 1970. So a little bit of context here. So in 1968, I'm sure you know, we have the start of the Prudhoe Bay oil rush with the first oil well to flare up in December of 1967. Then all of a sudden, this kind of mad rush to figure out how to get at this resource. And being on the north slope of Alaska, the question was, of course, how to get the oil to market. As you heard from Philip Wright earlier in this series, the settled answer was the Alaska pipeline, which was completed in 1977. But before the pipeline was built, Humble Oil attempted to prove the concept of shipping oil from Prudhoe Bay to the eastern seaboard through the Northwest Passage. To do this, they bought the SS Manhattan, pictured here, the largest tanker in America at the time, and converted it to be able to withstand ice. The story of this conversion is super fascinating. They topped it up and built it out and moved it from place to place and created a whole ice lab in Norway that kind of tested the concept and all sorts of stuff. So they converted it, built it to withstand ice, and then sailed it from the East Coast across the Arctic to Prudhoe Bay and loaded a ceremonial barrel of oil that was painted gold onto it and sailed back. Now, this was a widely celebrated journey. It was covered in all of the dailies at the time. It had a huge amount of press. There was, people flown in and out of the onto the Manhattan, sort of weekly. Everybody kind of got a turn to go on it. They had photographers and much of that detail is captured well in Ross Cohen's book, Breaking Ice for Arctic Oil, if you're interested in knowing more about the kind of detail of this story. And this celebration was partly because of the longstanding fascination with the Northwest Passage, right? This is There's a kind of famed landscape, and here was a real sort of modern intervention into it. It was also the kind of Arctic and Alaska's, sort of stepping out point. This was a moment for the North in general, and so it had a lot of popularity because of that. And of course, then there were the range of technological achievements that were made on the journey. This kind of massive icebreaker at the time, and the new sort of technologies that it deployed. But it was also not without its controversies. It only went to Prudhoe Bay and then back again, so it didn't technically fit the Northwest Passage, traverse from Atlantic to Pacific, even though it was open water all the way to the Pacific from there on in. It got stuck in the ice and had to be freed a couple times, so it wasn't really a full proof of concept. And one of the controversies that's sort of important for the story I'm telling is that it wasn't clear what kind of permission would be needed to travel through the Northwest Passage. So at issue for Canada here was the status of the Northwest Passage. Canada believes it to be sovereign waters, right? Internal waters that is controlled by Canada, whereas the United States and many other countries saw it as an international strait connecting two expanses of high seas. And if it's deemed to be an international strait, then ships are allowed to pass through it without permission, without kind of any sort of real check-in or regulation from the sovereign country that claims that territory. So because Canada believed that this was internal sovereign waters and the United States believed that it wasn't, there was a kind of miscommunication, a kind of purposeful set of miscommunications here. When it became public that this journey was going to happen, Canada expected the United States to ask for permission to travel through the passage, but no call came. Not to be daunted, Canada then decided, well, let's preempt this, and even though you're not calling us asking permission, we're going to give you permission, right? We know you're probably going to come around to it, so let's just give you permission. You have it. You can pass through. This is great. Even so, we'll actually add some help. We'll send along an icebreaker. We'll kind of visit and follow along with you as you go through the water. We'll give you an escort to make sure everything's safe. Now, ice is an important part of this story, right? Because if it was traveling through, sort of clear waters, then it would be hard to justify the kind of connection, the supervision of the Canadian Coast Guard that follows along. That would be an odd move if it wasn't, sort of sovereign waters. It wouldn't make sense. But because of the ice, because of the difficulty of the terrain, then this actually allowed for Canada to kind of extend its permission, not only to a symbolic gesture, but to actually become an on-the-ground, sort of jurisdictional process, a performance of that sovereignty. And in fact, during the transit, the Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers that accompanied the Manhattan, and here we have the Louis Saint Laurent, and there's actually another one in the back there. They actually were required to help fish the Manhattan out of some of the ice that it got stuck in. And so this kind of made Canada feel a little bit more bold in its position. And so in the face of increasing marine traffic through the Northwest Passage and the transit of the Manhattan, the Canadian government, which was led by Pierre Elliott Trudeau at the time, passed the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, which Andrew Stuhl talked about a couple of weeks ago. And this passage enabled, among other things, the policing of ships throughout the Northwest Passage in the name of protecting the Arctic environment. Basically, the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act argues that because of the special conditions of the Arctic ecosystem, there are extra measures that need to be taken in Arctic waters to ensure protection. These include the possibility of being denied access, of having the ship searched, and of course, of requiring permission to enter. Ice, again, was central to this jurisdictional claim. Ice creates the conditions of possibility to label the Arctic waters more dangerous, therefore requiring greater state control over who is in the water. The ability to search and limit all ships in the Northwest Passage meant that the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act worked as a de facto claim to sovereign waters, right? That because of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, Canada could act in the same way that it would act if everybody agreed that these were sovereign waters. The danger provided by ice covered waters and the concern for the pristine waters of the Arctic were thus drafted by what David Morin and Bora Plumtree call an environmentalism of convenience, in which these environmental protections were placed in the service of jurisdictional claims. The Arctic became mobilized here as a fragile place which must continually be protected from encroachment of the inevitable industrial development that was to come. Now, this Pollution Prevention Act was actually highly successful in terms of it wasn't contested by international actors. And in fact, it got included in a version into the United Nations Law of the Sea. And the logic that it supports has actually continued here, right? So it's not unusual for the jurisdiction enabled by the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act to be included in the yearly Canadian military exercises in the Arctic, which are known usually as Operation Nanook. So this is a chance where the Canadian military, usually in August, September, heads up into the Arctic and runs drills. And then often a number of times these drills sort of are search and seizure operations for ships that aren't supposed to be in the Arctic. And often that's based around, potential damaging material to the Arctic waters, or being able to ensure that they're following proper safety procedures. So in this story of the Manhattan's transit, we have two different visions of the northern future. On the one hand, you have the kind of initial prompt of the passage, which is a future of northern abundance, of oil throughout all the Arctic that we're going to be able to get via tanker passages through the Northwest Passage. And then you have this vision of loss, of potential damage caused by that encroachment, caused by that industrial development, and a very, very mobilized need to protect that future, that future of loss. Now, in this environmentalism of convenience, jurisdiction is provided by the need to protect the environment, a justification that attaches a future claim to the jurisdiction. In the future, the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act will have protected these ice-covered waters. An imagined success story is essential even if unwritten, for without the protected environment of the future, then the contemporary efforts to protect them and the jurisdictional claims and actions that follow become unnecessary. This ideal future that's projected onto this policy is one in which not only the environment is intact, but so too are the jurisdictional claims, projecting the state into an idealized environmental legal future. If the Arctic waters are protected in the future, the story goes, it will be in part due to the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act. So there's two things that I kind of want to unpack from this story. And the first is about jurisdiction, about the way in which sort of sovereignty and jurisdiction and the performance of both of those things come out and play out in this environmental story. And the second is this projection of the will have been future, the future that we want to assert in this realm. And so I'm going to start with unpacking that question of jurisdiction, and that will lead into this discussion of the future. In geography, the past decade has seen a renewed interest in jurisdiction, especially jurisdiction within a settler colonial context. As Shiri Pasternak argues, jurisdiction is the apparatus through which sovereignty is rendered meaningful, because it is through jurisdiction that settler sovereignty organizes and manages authority. Jurisdiction here is the ability to enforce governance over a particular area, what Pasternak describes as the authority to have authority, right? Jurisdiction becomes partly about who is going to enforce laws where, right? Whether it's province or the city or the federal government or things like that. But also it's more broadly that authority to enforce it, right? The authority to enforce an authority. And so in this way, jurisdiction is both a matter of the law, right? Where laws describe who it is that's going to have that kind of authority to enforce the rules. And jurisdiction is also something that precedes law, right? Where it needs to be in place in order for laws to act, to work out, right? The ability to assert jurisdiction enshrines the laws that it lays out. So in the context of colonialism, we often see this, right? So settler states, when they're challenged, often hang their sovereign claims on the ability to survey and police the territory in question, right? That they have to illustrate that, you know, we might say there's boots on the ground, or there's a legal sort of apparatus through which they can illustrate their sovereignty in the area. And in the Canadian North, jurisdiction is both a strategy of internal governance, right? Internal colonial governance, and an assertion of sovereignty. We probably have heard a number of the different ways that attempts to solidify Arctic sovereignty have had tremendous ramifications on Northern residents. The most pointed example here is the High Arctic Relocation Project of the Canadian government. So this was in the 1950s. The Canadian government relocated several Inuit families from Northern Quebec to the High Arctic with an official justification that where they were living was becoming overpopulated, and that had led to a decline in the ability to sustain themselves in that area. And so they were moving them to more productive grounds that they could flourish in. But when examined carefully, or not even that, not even that far of scratching the surface, it was pretty clear that this was a move to assert Canadian sovereignty in the High Arctic, to move populations of Canadian citizens into an area that was potentially deemed unpatrolled or unclaimed by Canada. And this is also one of the reasons why in Canada, Inuit got the right to vote earlier than other Indigenous populations, including First Nations. It was to allow them to become more clearly citizens of the state, thereby expanding the sort of sovereign claims of the state here. So sovereignty in these practices becomes not just an assertion, but a continual struggle for achievement, right? Sovereignty isn't just a statement, but rather it's a set of actions that play out over and over again around having the authority to have authority. Pasternak argues that insomuch as Canada is trying to fuse the jurisdictional claims over Indigenous lands, or fuse sovereignty to jurisdictional claims over Indigenous land, the project is and will continue to be incomplete. This is, I think, one of the most important things that we can think about in terms of jurisdiction here, right? That it is a constant ongoing process that's actually on the ground always going to be incomplete. So for Pasternak actually writes, the perfection of settler sovereignty, that is the fusing of sovereignty claims with the effective exercise of territorial jurisdiction over Indigenous lands, remains unfinished today. And so she maps out that case through the Algonquins of Barrier Lake and their challenges to the Canadian state. But we can also see this in the Arctic, right? In the Arctic jurisdiction, whether it's upholding colonial laws or game restrictions or patterns of sustenance, or whether it's providing social services or restricting access to certain parts of the territory, that jurisdiction was often accomplished poorly. And when it was accomplished with more success, it was only ever with the help of Inuit. That's like a I think, a fundamental feature of Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, that there's this partnership with Indigenous peoples that allows for the assertion of jurisdiction, both for the kind of internal colonial regulation that the Canadian state wants, but also for the projection of sovereignty into the future. And interestingly, there's a moment on the, I think it's on the second passage of the Manhattan, where Inuit actually block it on the ice until it asks for permission to go through, right? And this is something that the Canadian state couldn't accomplish, but was sort of performed by Inuit in the land. Now, this is not to say that that relationship has been conflict-free. Indigenous communities have always asserted their own claims to the land and have pushed back when they saw the opportunity or the need to do so. The fact that in the north, the territory is both land and ice is part of this particular operation of colonial jurisdiction, as I think the history of the Northwest Passage illustrates. The barriers of access, the inability for southern states to move as freely as they want through this sort of frozen land or this ice, densely iced land, or the general lack of knowledge of those southern actors about ice made for larger and larger cracks in the effective exercise of jurisdiction in the north. And this is something that James Wilt's work has been diving into. And in the chapter that I mentioned at the start, we have a section on the production of ice knowledge around the Arctic Pilot Project in it, which was a LNG transportation scheme from Melville Island to the East Coast using pipelines and Manhattan-style LNG icebreakers. And it was this kind of very complex proposal. And the project never came to fruition for a number of reasons. But as James's work shows, the knowledge over ice was folded into other projects in the north and contributed to an increasing confidence over ice specifically as they imagined it to be. So a particular type of sort of universal ice that acts in the same way, whether it's on Melville Island or whether it's in Baffin Bay or whatever. As the colonial state becomes more confident in its knowledge over ice, ice becomes then transformed into opportunities, or at the least, a manageable obstacle. Now, the negotiation of jurisdiction here is one of the key links in the continued vision of the future of abundance in the north. So while the Manhattan sort of was about both visions of the north, we still see both of them coming about. It wasn't that one was fading away and the other was rising, but we still have both. And so the vision of an Arctic full of resources available for profit is certainly in play now. And jurisdiction provides access and certainty for companies and state interested in those resources. But the political organization and contestation of Arctic Indigenous residents demand that they be included in that jurisdiction and that they have the ability to direct the future themselves and not be subject simply to sort of Southern demands. Now, in the age of devolution and the resolution of land claims in Northern Canada, the Canadian state downloaded jurisdictional practices onto the territories and Indigenous governments. And so this is kind of something starting from the 1970s onwards and really coming to fruition in the late 1990s, where Canada signs a number of modern land claims with Northern Indigenous groups. The establishment of Nunavut is part of this, and it moves towards downloading a number of the jurisdictional practices in the north onto those territories and onto those Indigenous groups. And this means that there becomes joint management initiatives, self-governing agreements, and other modern jurisdictional compromises that initiate a new period in settler jurisdiction, whereby the state officially cedes some control, but maintains what Pasternak describes as the authority to have authority. And so this is a sort of new sort of switch in jurisdictional practices in the north. And there's a lot of hope that these practices will share that jurisdiction and share that authority a little more. Now, we can look into this a little critically, and so you have Emily Cameron and Tyler Leviton's work on impact benefit agreements in Nunavut, and you also have Warren Bernauer's examination of the power imbalances of modern land claims and his continuing work on extraction and industrial development in the North. And this body of work that's coming out sort of suggests that although there have been changes made, jurisdiction still favors the settler and capitalist orientation of the federal government. However, as we saw earlier, and as Pasternak argues, jurisdiction is constantly being contested. And the recent conflicts in the North, including the Mary River mine expansion, which was put forward by the company and supported by the federal government, but actively contested by residents around it and eventually denied the expansion. This episode illustrates that there are definitely still many cracks in this colonial state's dream of authority in the North. So here we find ourselves with jurisdiction that is clearly tied to the way that the state understands both the landscape and the potential of it, right? This sort of future of the landscape. And as the Manhattan story tells us, the future of loss projected by the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act became one way to justify present exercises of jurisdiction. That lesson is definitely worth revisiting now, as the impacts of climate change and the onset of the Anthropocene enshrine this future of loss in our general approach to the Arctic, right? It becomes more pronounced as the more dominant way of thinking about the Arctic. As such, this future of loss stands to empower actors within the Arctic to mobilize the authority to have authority by virtue of this particular future, right? Instead of promoting an abundance, an empire peopled of white men, we see jurisdiction put forward on the basis of these kind of environmental claims. And I think it's necessary for us to think about when these are sort of environmentalisms of convenience, or what kind of on-the-ground impacts they have to jurisdictional claims and conflicts of this settler state. Now, I want to suggest here that this line of thinking, this sort of vision of the future, works through the grammatical tense of the future anterior, or what is often referred to as the future perfect. This is my one time where I do a grammar lesson, because normally I barely use capitals. So the future perfect is when you describe an action in the future that has already passed. So it uses the tense of it will have been. So for example, I could tell you that in 10 minutes, this talk will have been completed. Or for the students in this course, we could say that you will have been exposed to the leading areas of research in the humanities and social sciences in the Arctic. The Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act similarly was designed in this mode, right? So in the future, the Arctic Water Pollution Prevention Act will have protected the fragile Arctic ecosystem. In each case, the achievement and action are both in the future, but a future that will have already happened. The future anterior is a tense in which both the future and past collaborate to prescribe action, right? It gives us a path forward to that future and sort of charts that path fairly clearly. It's a bit of a clunky tense, and it doesn't actually get used that often, but understanding the future perfect does provide an insight into the logic that structures much of our way of thinking about the future, especially from the perspective of a colonial state that is continually asserting its jurisdiction. The future perfect, in many ways, holds the justification of the future action as having already happened. Of course, I will be done in 10 minutes, maybe even 5. Why would I keep talking? Of course, the students will be exposed to the leading areas of research because the list of speakers represents those leading areas. Of course, the Protection Act will keep the water safe as it has all of those provisions to keep track of what is happening in this delicate ecosystem. Yet it isn't the actions themselves that give meaning to these events. Rather, it is the outcome of the future that gives meaning to what is happening now. Defining my talk as over in the future assures you that there will in fact be a conclusion that wraps it all neatly together, something you might be doubting right now. Calling these speakers leading in this area creates both a topical bond between us, but it also establishes us as leaders in this field. Imagining a protected Arctic in the future makes the necessity of seeking permission and regulating passage into an environmental act not one of simple sovereignty. So when we look at these images or the actions of Operation Nanook, these are not just military actions or exercises, they are conservation practices, right? And so the future of the protected environment changes what we would normally see as a particularly sovereign kind of moment. So in the chapter that I wrote with Liam and James, we draw upon Liam's research into polar bear conservation to show how the image of the future Arctic reshapes the colonial jurisdiction in the North. This section examines the development of polar bear deterrence and safety programs in towns like Churchill and Arctia, and is in his investigation of the history of polar bear conservation in Canada, he found that the environmental concern about the future that threatens imminent extinction to polar bears has intensified management of the interactions between humans and bears in the interest of preserving the threatened species. Alongside the restriction on polar bear hunting and harvesting that are typical of wildlife conservation, there has also been a rise of urban safety protocols that focus on protecting Arctic communities against polar bears through non-lethal force. These polar bear monitoring and deterrence programs attempt to create secure spaces for people around Arctic settlements without threatening the lives of polar bears, as was normal in the past. While some programs have been operational since the 1980s, they are by no means widely adopted. Deterrence and monitoring programs are a proposed technological fix to the growing tensions between the goals of conservation and the demand for safety. In reworking the relationship between people and polar bears, they draft the future loss of an ice-covered Arctic into the changing jurisdictional claims over northern indigenous spaces. That is, they use the projections of Arctic ice, which then limit the livelihood of polar bears, into the ways that Arctic urban communities are managing themselves. As Liam points out in this chapter, the iconic status of the bear and its protections have created a legal and political framework that foregrounds the mournability of polar bear deaths, right? That polar bear deaths become a kind of marker of our failure to reach that future that we want. These frameworks advance a somewhat contradictory set of conservation values that police direct interactions with polar bears and humans while failing to address the structural causes of stress onto the species, right? We're very familiar with the ways in which polar bears have been drafted to become a kind of an emotional bond to motivate people to act about climate change, right? That this becomes a story that we have to act on because of these charismatic megafauna. But that also has other implications in the ways that humans and polar bears interact. So under Canadian state jurisdiction, polar bear mortality may be consistently tragic, but it is only made criminal when there is someone who pulls the trigger. That is to say that the deaths of polar bears are happening because of climate change, but they're also happening through hunting permits. So in Nunavut, there are hunting permits and quotas allowed for polar bear deaths that are regulated. But if a polar bear death happens, polar bear is shot outside of those regulations, then it becomes a criminal act. And this was made clear when a Nook hunter who killed a bear that he and others thought were dangerous to their community was prosecuted and given warning for not hunting with a permit. So charges were pressed, But then when brought into the process, they were given simply a warning as opposed to actually being punished for it. And so although the hunter did not face punishment, the mournability of the polar bear, based on the potential loss of the species in the future, enshrined the state's actions as an exception when it was actually entitled to punish the hunter, right? That the warning was a conscientious gesture to the hunter and not an exception, and not a regular practice, right? That this shouldn't continue. So this is where we can see the impact of the future perfect mode of reasoning. In setting out a future, indeed the future perfect, this way of thinking allows for the promised future to override present concerns and impact. It is the grammatical tense that emphasizes ends over means. The future becomes the goal to be had, and the process by which we get there is justified, if even given meaning, by its path to the future that we are presented with. For me, I think this leads into a discussion of how the future perfect leads into what scholars often call the post-political moment, when decisions are made not by a sort of careful consideration of a lot of different options, but by charting out a specific path provided by experts to an already established ends. So in the case of polar bears, the protection of polar bears in the future, the sustainability of the species, justifies the suspicion of the motivation of the hunter and the management of his and others' actions. Importantly, there is no opportunity to examine the relationships and politics outside of this frame. As Liam points out, the overwhelming threat to polar bears is not hunting, but the loss of ice that is oncoming from climate change. Yet the discussion being had is about whether or not this hunter was justified in killing the bear, not whether there is a larger set of circumstances that need to be changed that are impacting polar bears. The future perfect limits our ability to contest what actions we can take in this present moment. So this is where I wrap it up, and I get to say we have had completion. So in both of these cases of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act and the Polar Bear Alert programs, the future of ice is folded into the jurisdictional claims to Arctic space. In them, the future that will have been becomes a fundamental part of the authority on the ground. The challenge for us as academics looking into this, as invested actors in the future, becomes how do we think about the future, a future that is certainly in need of thought, given the kinds of changes that are happening, without prescribing a kind of ends that overrides the present politics that happen around it. I don't have the full answer to that, but I have a little bit of a hint to what I think we should be doing. In her discussion of the temporality of Indigenous peoples in late liberalism, Elizabeth Pavanelli describes what she calls the governance of the prior, in which Indigenous peoples are relegated to the past of the nation. This is probably a very familiar story if you've looked at the kind of way that Indigenous peoples get folded into national narratives, right? It becomes a sort of building block upon which the new nation, the settler nation, is built upon, that pulls from the strength of that and overcomes it, right? And so contemporary settler colonialism, Pavanelli argues, does not eliminate Indigenous peoples from their stories, symbols, or myths. Instead, they are separated within these discourses to a different temporality. When we look at these different narratives, she writes, we find that although all people governed by the nation may belong to nationalism, not all people occupy the same tense of nationalism. The settler state reserves the future perfect, which justifies its jurisdiction for those discourses that reproduce settler-oriented capitalist growth. And I think if we dig into the material around the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, or dig into the material around polar bear conservation, this holds true, that the contributions of Indigenous people into these knowledges is kind of pushed to the past. or pushed to a temporality that speaks to the past. The way it was, traditional knowledge, the practices of the land as it used to be, and not as accepted in the ways that we think about the future to come. Looking at the securitization of bare human interactions and the protection of sovereign waters, it is possible to see the future perfect of the Anthropocene asserting a continual settler state. These discourses, importantly, are being contested by Indigenous actors who have increasingly contested colonial control in the Arctic. And so one way that we might support this contestation is to illustrate the ways in which the temporal narratives of ice, of polar bears, of resources in the north are set up in a way that restrict the influence of Indigenous jurisdiction and modes of governance on our visions for the future. We've come to a point where I think we have very clearly accepted Indigenous visions of the past and potentially a little bit of the present, but it's hard to see how those visions, Indigenous visions for the future, are being integrated into settler dreams for the future. And so with that call to think about that temporality of the future, the way that we project the future forward, I'm going to end there and open up for questions and comments. So thank you very much.